Liebe Freundinnen und Freunde der Progress Foundation, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, Ladies and Gentlemen, welcome to our 58th Economic Conference. My friends on the Board of Trustees, first and foremost Ivan Adamovic, who has been instrumental in organizing this conference, and myself, are delighted to welcome so many of you today. My special welcome goes to our two speakers, Mr. Kwasi Kwarteng, former Chancellor of the Exchequer under Liz Truss, and Professor Lars Feld from the University of Freiburg in Breisgau, former Chairman of the German Council of Economic Experts, and current economic, not political, advisor to Minister Christian Lindner. You will find, or you have found, their impressive CVs on your seats. I would also like to welcome to the podium Jörg Müller, the fourth director in the history of Avenir Suisse, and my best successor there so far, as well as our tried and tested moderator, Mark Dittli from the Market NZZ. Please welcome them all with a big round of applause. And finally, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ms. Alexandra Jansen today. Our Board of Trustees has elected her as new trustee at its last meeting, and we are all very pleased about this reinforcement and rejuvenation of our board. Welcome, Alexandra. Das Thema unserer heutigen Konferenz lautet The Sustainability of Government Debt. Man kann sich fragen, warum wir dieses Thema überhaupt gewählt haben bei einer Staatsverschuldung in der Schweiz, expliziten Staatsverschuldung von Bund, Kantonen und Gemeinden von ungefähr 30% des BIP oder sogar ein bisschen darunter. Und nachdem wir auch Gäste aus Liechtenstein hier haben, einer Staatsverschuldung von 0 im zur Frankenzone gehörenden Liechtenstein. Aber bekanntlich ist die Schweiz zwar eigenständig und eigenwillig, aber keine Insel. Und schon in der Nachbarschaft sieht es anders aus. In Deutschland ist der explizite staatliche Schuldenberg mit 60% gemessen am BIP doppelt so hoch, in Österreich sind es 80%, in Frankreich 110%, in Italien 140%, Großbritannien liegt bei ungefähr 100%, Japan schlägt unter den Industrieländern mit 250% alle Rekorde. Besonders beunruhigend sind aber wohl doch die USA. Allein auf Bundesebene reden wir hier von Schulden von ungefähr 35 Billionen, deutschen Billionen, also 35.000 Milliarden Dollar. Da wird jedem normalen Bürger schwindlig. Der Betrag entspricht gut 120% der jährlichen Wirtschaftsleistung. Ein ähnliches Niveau wurde zuletzt nach dem Ende des Zweiten Weltkriegs erreicht. Bis 2050 wird ein Anstieg auf 180% erwartet. Als Folge dieser Entwicklung geben die USA schon heute mehr Geld für Zinszahlungen als für Verteidigung aus, nämlich jährlich über 1 Billion Dollar, also 1000 Milliarden Dollar. Das kann doch nicht ewig so weitergehen, sagt der gesunde Menschenverstand. Ob die Ökonomie und die Politik das anders sehen, Das werden wir hoffentlich gleich erfahren. Dazu nur ganz wenige einleitende Gedanken. Erstens, Nachhaltigkeit ist erstrebenswert, aber wir Liberalen gehören nicht zu jenen, die nur in Sachen Umwelt Nachhaltigkeit einfordern und das dann fast kompromisslos. Wir halten vielmehr den Gedanken der Nachhaltigkeit in Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft für ebenso wichtig. Und kaum etwas verstößt so sehr gegen die Nachhaltigkeit wie das Haushaltgebaren vieler Staaten, die, wie etwa Frankreich, seit Jahrzehnten Jahr für Jahr Defizite produzieren und damit immer größere Schuldenberge anhäufen. Zweitens, Schuldenbremsen sind der Versuch, die fiskalische Nachhaltigkeit institutionell abzusichern, wenn sie klug konstruiert sind, und das heißt nicht zu lax, nicht zu löchrig und möglichst umfassend, dann erfüllen sie diese Aufgabe hervorragend. Drittens, alles, was nicht nachhaltig ist, muss irgendwann an eine Grenze stoßen. Es ist genauso banal, wie es der bekannte amerikanische Ökonom Herbert Stein einmal formuliert hat: If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Aber wann und wie das geschehen wird, das ist alles andere als banal. Es ist ziemlich unklar. Manchmal setzt die Ökonomie Grenzen, manchmal spielen die Finanzmärkte verrückt oder vielleicht auch nicht verrückt. Das musste Kwasi Kwarteng erfahren. Die Politik macht dagegen Schulden selten zum Thema. Und wenn, dann nur in der Opposition. Regierungen profilieren sich dagegen fast nie durch einen Abbau des Schuldenberges. Das wird an der Wahlurne schlicht nicht genügend honoriert. Und viertens, realistische Auswege aus der hohen Staatsverschuldung gibt es eigentlich nur zwei. Der eine ist eine länger andauernde Inflation, welche die Schulden real abwertet. Der andere ist der Zugriff auf private Vermögen, also die zwangsweise Übernahme von Staatsschulden durch die Bürger des Landes. Und weil beide so schmerzhaft sind, passiert nichts, wird weitergewurstelt und schlittern wir immer noch stärker in die staatliche Überverschuldung, bis der Krug endgültig bricht. The habitués among you know the procedure for our conference is always more or less the same. First speaks now Kwasi Kwarteng on the challenges of growth in English. Then Lars Feld asks, why are government debts a burden? And he does this in German. And then starts without any break the panel under the lead of Mark Ditley, where all participants speak in their mother tongue. Mark Ditley will help with translations whenever it seems necessary. The panel should end ideally 1:45, 5 minutes to 1, the absolute latest, since my final remarks always also need some time. And after my final remarks, you will get some finger food and perhaps a glass of wine around 1 o'clock. Let me remind you that the speeches and the discussion are recorded and filmed and will be accessible on our website within a few days. And now, Kwasi Kwarteng, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I was just talking to Ivan that ich habe Deutsch in der Schule gelernt, aber ich kann nicht so gut Deutsch sprechen, diese ganze Rede. ausgeben auf Deutsch. Und so ich werde nur English sprechen, if you can make sense of that. But I'll try and follow some of the conversation. And actually, I picked up on some of the remarks that your very kind introducer gave. And I think it's very relevant to what I'm going to talk about. The debt levels that we're seeing are completely historic. But as was remarked, we don't know how this is going to end. We don't know how this story is going to end. And to quote an English economist, a very famous English economist, John Maynard Keynes, to give a gloss on the earlier remark, markets can remain irrational for longer than you can remain solvent. So just because something seems crazy, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to end anytime soon. And we've seen this with Japan. I mean, I remember 20 years ago, people were saying there's no way the Japanese government can borrow more money. And a lot of bond traders lost a lot of money trying to short Japanese government debt because they thought it was unsustainable. 20 years on, as was remarked, their national debt to GDP is 250%. So let me just rattle through some of my remarks. Challenges of growth, because the only way that you're going to break out of a debt bind that we're in is through growth. And that was very much the story of my short time as Treasury Minister, as Chancellor of the Exchequer. We had to get growth going. And the reason why I think the markets reacted with the unfunded tax cuts as they perceived them, and I think there was a lot of panic within the government. And we didn't hold the line, unfortunately. And so we were removed, and now the UK is facing increased taxes, and it's not very clear where the growth is coming from. So let's look at the problem. Your German is better than mine, but that basically says that, and this is Merkel 11 years ago, and she very clearly put, Europa hat heute noch etwas 7% of the world population. Europe is 25% then of global GDP, but 50% of social spending. And she said, we can't keep this prosperity. We can only keep this prosperity if we are innovative and if we can, I don't know how you'd say that, how we turn ourselves to the best policies, I suppose. But that hasn't happened. If anything, the numbers are worse. Certainly we're a lot less than 25% of global GDP. I think it's under 20%. And I suspect that the population, the proportion of the population has gone down as well, even though the welfare spending probably hasn't gone down that much. So that's the problem. And this is actually a historical version of the same problem. What's happened since about 1970 is a real slowdown, and you could see it was very much accelerated in this century, a real slowdown in GDP growth rates amongst the G7, amongst the wealthiest countries in the world. And there are lots of causes for this. Historians and economists and academics have been debating this for many years. Lower productivity. Some people might say that there's lower population growth in developed countries. That's an issue. Lots of causes for this, but you can see how dramatically that's in the graphical way. 4.7% between 1950 and 73, 2.8% between 73 and 2008. That's the period that I imagine most of us grew up in. And then in the last 15, 16 years, you've seen a massive tail off. And of course, the golden age of capitalism, Wirtschaftswunder, les 30 Glorieuses, 45 to 75 roughly. Then you had the oil shock in 73, which marked a Wendungspunkt, you could say a turning point. And then, of course, the second big turning point was the global financial crisis. And we've lived through most of these events. And it's a completely different world. We've got to understand this. It's a completely different world today than was the case 30, 40 years ago. And it's for those of us, in middle age, dare I say, we really have to shift our way of thinking to deal with this. These are more graphs showing GDP change compared to where we are this year compared to pre-pandemic levels. And you can see the UK and Germany are struggling, and the US. And this is a big issue. Certainly when I speak to French politicians and financiers in London, the US is really outstripping us very considerably at the moment, and over the last 5 to 10 years. More graphs. That's just a cartoon. For those of you who think more in pictures than numbers, this is einfacher zu vorstellen. Government spending. So this is the critical issue that I was dealing with. When I became Treasury Minister, Chancellor, in September 2022, our government spending had gone through the roof. And just to give you some hard figures, when I became an MP in 2010, the UK was spending £700 billion, and we were getting in 540, so there was a huge deficit. It was about 160 billion. By 2022, mainly because of COVID, the 700 billion figure had gone to 1 trillion, or 1,000 billion, as you pointed out. We changed it to the American billions in 1974, and I think that's when we decided to spend a lot more money. It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence, I think, that's what happened. But generally, you can see the COVID period, sort of beginning of 2020, marked a real spike in spending. And this is how the spending is allocated. And that's really the social protection, if I can focus on that. Whoops, no, I want to. The social protection, which is the top line, if you can see that, the biggest segment. That's what Angela Merkel was talking about. That's what she was referring to is 50% of global social spending was spent in Europe. So that 19.5% probably marks approximately 50% of the amount spent globally on welfare. And this is a 2022 figure. So this is so they're all snails. You see, when you look at from the top, they look like impressive athletes. But when you look at what's going on underneath, no one's moving. Okay, that's the point that this is making. They can all look very impressive, these national economies, but there's very little movement. I mean, this isn't a case of the tortoise and the hare. This is just a snail. The snail doesn't win anything. Okay. So solutions, and this is really where my career was very much focused on. I think we tried to do a lot very, very fast. And that was perhaps why we were unstuck. I was unstuck, and of course the Prime Minister, having removed me from office, I think she resigned 6 days later. Which was, I always say that, in English we have this expression, I think it's an American expression originally, you were thrown under the bus. But if the person throwing you under the bus is knocked over by the next bus, it's a pretty futile thing. And I think she saw, frankly, how difficult, that there was no way out. At that point, and I wish we'd held the line a bit more. Anyway, so these are different forms of growth strategies that I've cobbled together from around the world. I mean, this is neo-mercantilism, exports-driven, discourages imports to increase the level of foreign reserves. This is a model that I think the Chinese certainly have followed in the last 20, 30 years. I would argue the Japanese followed it after the war when they kept their currency very, very low. It's 360 yen to the dollar in 1949, and it's appreciated obviously considerably since then. And even the Deutschmark, compared to the British pound in 1949, I think it was 11 to 1. But by the time the Germany joined the euro, it was more like sort of 1.95. I remember going as a child to Germany in the 80s, and even then it was, I think, 3 or 3.5 Deutschmarks to a pound. So the Deutschmark, even in that last period, between the mid-80s and joining the euro, appreciated very considerably. But they kept these currencies low to drive this. And these are various neo-mercantile. You could look at China, Singapore, Vietnam to a lesser degree today, and this is some sort of philosophy. That isn't Thomas Mann, by the way. I don't know who. Thomas Mann was dead by 1650. This is Malthus, population Malthus, who, so I think, I don't know why we got that wrong, but that is not Thomas Mann. And I don't think this is a model that really works, because it doesn't take an Einstein to work out that not everyone can do this. You know, if you're an economic nationalist and you're trying to drive exports, you know, someone has to take your exports in the form of imports. You can't have a whole global system where everyone is a net exporter. Doesn't make sense. So it's not something which can be adopted universally, and it's very much a competitive situation. This is, I think, the closest to what we have in Europe, and I call it the Nordic model just for the sake of a quick, snappy phrase. But and actually, funnily enough, a lot of those Nordic nations are moving slightly away from this because they realize that their tax levels were probably too high, and a number of non-Nordic European countries have adopted this. So it's essentially a kind of middle way. There's some capitalism, there's a big welfare state, very low wage dispersion, so there's more equality, very high levels of public expenditure, and particularly on welfare. And I think this model is changing because it relies on a lot of cohesion and a lot of agreement and consensus in societies, but we've got more diverse societies, particularly the Nordic countries themselves are more diverse. They've got greater ethnic diversity, they've got greater population in terms of the philosophy, diversity. Even Norway, which is a very wealthy country, is moving slightly away from this. And these were, for the history of this, those of you interested in history, the context of the Nordic model is now 80, 90 years old. It's something in the 1930s where, you know, labor rights, social welfare reforms were seen to be necessary to stave off particularly the threat of communism, the Bolsheviks. You've got to always think about the Bolshevik context for a lot of this. But it's questionable how sustainable this is. And I think that is Tage Erlander. But I wouldn't know. I know my English economists better than I know my Swedish politicians, I'm afraid. But I think that's the right man. And he was a big figure in constructing, you know, the social democratic consensus. And that's just a summary of the Nordic model. And this is, I think, where I think we can make most progress. Of the three models, very crudely, neo-mercantilism, Nordic model, supply-side liberalism, if you like. I think this is the way forward. And unlike the mercantilist model, there's no reason why more and more countries can't adopt this. It's not a zero-sum game in the way that mercantilism is. As I said, in mercantilism, if you export, someone has to take in your exports in the form of imports. This is a model that lots of countries can follow. And these are. I think we recognize these people, but they are basically the poster children of the kind of supply side reforms I want to see, many people in this room want to see, and I think we will have to get back to at some point. Lee Kuan Yew. Now, John Cooperthwaite, before I finish, he's one of the great unsung heroes of liberalism because he went to Hong Kong, I think, in '61, and essentially, whenever he got submissions saying we should put up taxes, he just used to rip them up and throw them away. And under his direction, Hong Kong became a real engine of the kind of free market capitalism and dynamism that many people want to see. And I think that's our best hope. In conclusion, I pretty much set out what I believe. And I think now more than ever, it's critical that we look at some of these solutions. And I would suggest that some form of liberalization, reducing taxes, but above all, and this is where we went wrong, this is my big regret as a finance minister, you've got to have courage on expenditure. It's no good saying you can reduce taxes and they'll pay it for itself, even if you believe that, because you've got to convince One has to convince the swing voter and also the markets that you're not going to just rely on a free lunch, as the head of Goldman said to me. You've got to show some discipline and some credibility on the spending side of the equation. And that's where I think a lot of the future discussion will be focused on. So thank you. I'm sorry that I've cut my remarks short, but I think there's plenty of people who want to contribute. And I think it'll be a very lively discussion. So danke sehr.